He's the deputy editor of the National Security and Foreign Policy at the media publication Newsweek, joining us from New York. Tom, always good to have you on TRT World. So it seems right now that from last week's plan and the one that the Europeans seem to be etching out, we essentially have two plans, the US one, the European one. America's plan, some analysts say, does seem to favor Russia. Is this all going to come down to marrying these two deals in some way that then suits both Russia and Ukraine, or are they simply too far apart right now?
Well, certainly, I think that there is quite a bit of distance between these two plans. They really don't resemble each other much at all. The European plan certainly did not include anything when it comes to territorial concessions on the part of Ukraine, to name just one factor. And I think that the one thing that, of course, for better or for worse, that the U.S. plan, an advantage of it was the fact that it seemed to be more grounded in the situation on the ground. Obviously, that does not favor Ukraine as well. But I think at this point in the conflict, we're coming to a point where we're going to have to see some compromises made by both sides. And unfortunately, again, the situation on the ground stands where Russia does have a significant amount of the territorial claims already in its hands. So convincing Russia to withdraw from that takes a level, I think, of compromise and concessions that I don't think that either the U.S. or Ukraine can offer at this moment. So land is key to this. Of course, the other parts having to do with Ukraine's admission into NATO, having to do with the size of the Ukrainian military. These two, of course, will be finer points, I think, that are going to have to be dealt with quite creatively if there's going to be any sort of synergy and composition between these two plans to resemble one another.
And when you talk of the compromise here, when we look at some of the military gains over the last few weeks, Russia does seem to have the upper hand. At this stage, can Ukraine actually afford to continue fighting, especially if they don't continue to get support from some of their key allies like the United States?
Well, certainly that's always been a fear since this war began. There was a lot of people when this invasion started in February 2022 who thought there wouldn't be a Ukrainian government at all, as far as we know it, by March 2022. Obviously, that's not the case today. Ukraine was able to fend off significant Russian advances. And there may have been a time where it seemed that Russian troops could have pushed off of at least most of Ukrainian land that they had taken initial phases of the war. That doesn't seem to be the case today. Each day, it's costly for both sides, but Ukraine has some key disadvantages that are only becoming exacerbated as the war goes on. And the key one there is manpower. Even with Europe and the U.S. supplying significant support, the one thing they can't supply, or at least are unwilling to supply, is actual manpower. This is a serious issue for Ukraine. And you're right in saying that the Russians do appear to have the upper hand when it comes to a long-term war of attrition, which is exactly the kind of war that we're fighting. It doesn't seem that either side is going to win this war completely in a military way anytime soon. But the situation as it stands right now makes it very costly and uncertain for Ukraine to continue without seriously considering their alternatives. And unfortunately, even that U.S. plan, the first phase of it, is one of those alternatives right now.
And one of those alternatives, as we mentioned earlier, is ceding some of the land that Russia has already taken. This all speaks to Ukraine's territorial integrity. And if Kyiv does end up actually giving up that land, what kind of precedent do you think it sets for other conflicts around the world?
Well, nobody wants to see the borders change, I think, in terms of the international community looking on to this. And that includes even countries, I think, that are close to Russia, countries like China, for example. The idea of territorial integrity is something that it's enshrined in the UN Charter, for example. But this is the reality we're facing right now. This war has been going on for over 3 years. It shows no sign of stopping, again, on the battlefield alone. So I think that in the pure effort of wanting to put an end to the bloodshed, the economic disruption this has caused, the loss of life, the fears of this conflict potentially even spiraling into something worse, a direct confrontation between major world powers, there's a lot of people who would breathe a sigh of relief just to see the guns silenced. And of course, that is the main priority here.
And one of those people who would breathe a sigh of relief is Donald Trump. He's been wanting to bring this conflict to an end since he came back into office at the end of January. Do you think he still has reason to be as optimistic as he continues to be, despite kind of going back and forth between both sides over the last few months?
Well, I think that there are reasons to be somewhat hopeful in the fact that there has been progress, that there are now actual drafts being made. Of course, I think the Ukrainians had no celebrations when they saw the initial U.S. plan. I think that the European plan was perhaps not a step forward in terms of actually reflecting reality on the ground. Some people said it looked to be designed just to make sure that Russia would say no to it. And so I think that what we need right now is to see an escalation of the bilateral diplomacy between Washington and Kyiv and Washington and Moscow into something more trilateral that demonstrates that all three parties are willing to talk, are able to sit at the table and hash out some of those finer points. Which, of course, there are significant differences, again, in the different versions that we've seen out there. We need some clarity. I think the world needs some clarity as well. If President Trump is serious about this, which, again, I think it's commendable that he has been undergoing these tough meetings. His administration has been leading these efforts far more than any other power. There is a reason to want to pay attention to this and see this succeed. But there's a lot of work ahead, and perhaps the hardest work is still ahead.
Absolutely. Tom O'Connor, great to get your take live to us there from New York. Tom's from Newsweek.